Hey guys, and welcome back to the mudstudsskullcaps podcast. I'm Robin.
And I'm Kelsey. And for today's episode, we're going to be talking all things lunging. We want to share how we use lunging in our weekly training programs, what equipment we use or don't use when we lunge, and how we incorporate different lunging types into our program.
So, how do we want to get into our topic today? I know we both have a lot of strong opinions about why people lunge, the horses they lunge, the gear people use, the gear they don't use.
Yes, there's a lot when it comes to lunging, but I think I just want to start with why as riders do we lunge our horses? What is the reason you lunge your horse? What is the reason I lunge my horse? Sort of just starting with why it's important or not important as riders to lunge your horse.
Yeah, so when I lunge Trin, I don't use it as a replacement for one of our rides. I use it as kind of a supplement on a day when she would typically have off. And I use it not to teach her an upper level frame or to teach her, an outline to carry herself in. I just use it to get her to stretch out her whole body and just stretch long and low and just elongate her whole top line.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I do with mine. Mine is really for a gait and balance builder for my horse. So it's really a way for me to work on her quality of gait. For Addie, it's really about, for both Addie and Nim, lunging is all about balance. They're crooked and unbalanced in different ways. And for me, lunging is really it's an opportunity for them to figure out how to use their bodies. So I don't really lunge with gear on because I don't want that to affect the way my horse is moving. I want them to first figure out how to move their bodies correctly and in a balanced way of going. And the circle really helps with that, creating that need for balance so they're not water skiing at the end of the lunge line and that they are figuring out how to use their feet underneath them.
Oh, that's actually a really good point. I use it as well to remove myself as the rider from the equation and remove my own off-balanceness and crookedness from it so that way I'm no longer hindering them and that my horse can figure out how to use their own body without all my jankiness going on. And then I kind of like to use it to redevelop our communication with one another because sometimes I feel when I'm not using my voice commands when I'm riding is that I lose that aid a little bit. And so I like to just use it to reestablish that and make things that make our communication clearer with one another once again.
Yeah, because I do something similar I have when I lunge her. There's different ways to lunge a horse. There's, you can lunge on a long line or a lunge line, the traditional type. You could free lunge them, or you could do more of a horsemanship style lunging. And I use that, doing buck Brannaman style. Each horsemanship trainer has their own little nuances to the way they lunge, but this is usually when your horse is on a 10-foot lead rope or a little bit longer, probably usually more a 12 to 14-foot lead rope, and they're moving more off of your body cues. And that I love to use when my horse is blowing through me, because it's whoa, 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 do you even know I'm here? And I love using horsemanship type lunging to get her to focus back on me and kind of rebuild that connection that we may have lost. If she didn't go through a gate nicely, then we go back to the arena and you're going to work on paying attention to my body cues, and then we're going to try going through the gate again. So I love using that horsemanship style lunging just to get her focused on me and paying attention and really just kind of light on her feet, getting her thinking and responding really quickly. And it's great because you don't have to be rough. You don't have to be mean. You don't have to be aggressive to get them to pay attention. You can use your flag really tactfully. You can use your lead rope really tactfully. And your horse becomes so light at the end of your lead rope, which I love that. It should be remembered, the lunge line, whether you're doing a join up, whether you're free lunging or lunging in a traditional sense, the lunge line is a place the horse needs to be working. And you often have to start at the very bottom of that training pyramid with relaxation, with rhythm, in order to get quality lunging, no matter what type of lunging you're doing. Lunging should be an opportunity to slow things down and focus on one area of weakness. It's not it's not a replacement for a ride. It's not a replacement for a rider, but it's the slowing down and pausing for a moment to work on something specific.
Right. And no matter what kind of lunging you're doing that day, or if you're using gear, if you're not using gear. You need to have a goal, a purpose. You need to have something you're working towards to accomplish with your lunging session. Otherwise, your horse is just out there going around and around in circles, putting strain on their joints for absolutely no purpose, no reason. Have a goal. Know why you're out there, why you're doing this.
Yeah, and I think that goes back, you need to, what is my goal? What is my purpose? What am I trying to do? And then from there, you can decide what equipment do I need, what style I'm going to use. Those sort of decisions then will come once you have that goal defined. For example, this past winter and spring, I was not cantering Addie under saddle at all. Her canter to the right was a hot mess. Her canter to the left was almost perfect, but her canter to the right was one of those things where I was like, maybe she just doesn't canter to the right, which I have since learned it's true. She actually just doesn't canter to the right for various reasons. But we stopped cantering under saddle and we would lunge once or twice a week and without gear, and she would work on her canter on the circle and just finding her balance, because that was the biggest thing. She just couldn't find her balance with me on her. And doing that for several months, once, maybe twice a week, at the end of that 3-month period, I actually had a canter. It was amazing. I could canter my horse under saddle, and I stopped cantering her under saddle. We took the time to just really work on that balance, that strength, that gait development, and we made huge, huge improvements and huge strides with her canter, and with her just knowing where her body was. And so that's where I think lunging can be really beneficial, right? You are just sort of picking this one area to really devote the time to without the rider.
Yeah, to me, that's an appropriate way to use lunging. That's an accurate way to use it, what it's meant to be used for. And yet sometimes I find myself at horse shows watching someone lunging their horse, and I'm standing there grasping, trying to figure out, why are we doing this today? What's your goal? What you going for, man?
Yeah, so lunging in my mind is not a replacement for warm-up. I know that this is this is a traditional thought that you can lunge your horse and then you're going to get on and have a better ride. You only get about 15, 20 minutes on the lunge line before you've used your horse's body for the day. Lunging is hard on their joints. It is hard on their hocks. It is doing circle after circle after circle is really challenging. Whether they're in gear or not in gear, it's challenging. And this is why one of my biggest pet peeves is people who lunge hot horses. This drives me insane because it makes no sense. If you have a hot horse and you put them on the end of the lunge line, and oftentimes they have side reins on, oftentimes they're tacked up, and they do this often before a ride, all you're doing is letting a hot, unbalanced horse basically rip their body apart. Why would you waste 20 minutes doing that?
Well, it's frustrating because there's a way to lunge a hot horse. There's a way you can go about it correctly, and it's not through letting them go out to the end of the lunge line and run around. It's through slow work, going slow.
Right. Lunging is not a place to tear around. My horse needs to slow down. My horse needs to be balanced. Even my yearling, who I do lunge periodically, not a lot, but just a little bit, you need to go slow. He doesn't get to buck on the lunge line. He doesn't get to play. And so seeing a hot horse that's just ripping around, they're hollow, they're not balanced, they're just making their situation worse and not making it better. I would much prefer seeing someone with a hot horse get on and just do canter sets. Just do trot and canter sets for 20 minutes. You're not going to wear his body down. Get him balanced. You're going to be able to get him forward. You're going to be able to get him, because racing around is not the same as free forward movement. Those are two different things. And oftentimes a hot horse isn't relaxed. Oftentimes a hot horse isn't using their body correctly. They need more leg often to balance and engage their hind end, and you're not getting that if you're lunging them.
Yeah. Part of the issue, though, that I think comes in when you see this type of lunging being used on hot horses is that it comes out of a place of fear from the rider, is that it's too much horse for that rider. It's not the right horse for them. And so they're scared to get on. And so, yes, doing trot sets, canter sets to get that energy out in the beginning is a valid option. It's not an option to them because they're afraid. They don't want to get on the horse because they're scared they're going to get hurt. It comes out of a place of fear. And so these other options never present themselves because they're not confident.
If you are not comfortable getting on your horse and doing canter sets when they're acting up and being hot, then that is not the horse for you. You are overhorsed, and it is time to look for a different partner. And I think that's a lot of times people are like, oh, well, he's just a thoroughbred. Oh, that's just his nature. And that's just an excuse. Like, my horses are crazy some days when I go to get them. They're ripping and tearing around the arena. And I think anyone who saw me and was like, you're going to ride that? Like, are you sure this is not the best decision? Like, they're going crazy, bucking, galloping, whatever. As soon as that halter goes on, as soon as we head to the cross ties, it's over. We're done. We're quiet. And I'm not afraid to get on my horse. Sometimes she's still a little antsy. Sometimes, like, I know I'm going to, as soon as I sit down, we're just going to trot. I'm not going to try to get her to walk. I'm not going to try to get her to relax at the walk. It's not going to happen. We're just going to go. I feel totally safe, totally comfortable getting on my horse and doing that. And I, knock on wood, like, it's worked out every single time. As soon as she gets in the cross ties, or as soon as I get on her, it's over. It's done. She knows it's work time. She's done being psycho. But trust me, my horse is queen of being psycho 5 minutes before I go to catch her to ride. Like, she does it. Like, she goes crazy. Part of that is a respect issue, though. Like, she respects me enough to know once she's caught, once we're, going to work, she wants to work, she wants to do her job. And if your horse is still being psycho in the cross ties, they're still being psycho as you try to get them to the round pen or wherever you're going to lunge, not the horse for you. Or he needs serious ground manners training. Like, that's not an excuse.
And we're not saying that we don't understand when people have a horse that's a little bit hotter and that you do want to lunge them a little bit prior to maybe putting them in their cross ties where they act up and they leap around. I understand that, but that kind of work needs to be done relatively slow. And at a walk, you're doing groundwork with them to establish your communication and that it's not okay for them to behave this way when you're on the ground. It's not an excuse, though, to go and put them in the round pen and run them around until they're hot and sweaty and tired, nor is it an excuse to let them go out to the end of their lunge line and run around until they're hot, sweaty, and tired. We understand there's horses out there with a lot of energy that jump around, throw their bodies all over the place. We get that, but the end of the lunge line is not the place for them to be doing that.
Right. And so for me, and again, this is probably another topic for another day, but don't confuse bad manners, don't confuse lack of turnout, and don't confuse pain for a hot horse who just needs to be lunged.
Yes.
Your horse should stand quietly and be groomed no matter what the age is, no matter what happened. I mean, if he didn't get turned out that day, he's been locked in. You're going to make tons of excuses for him. Just free lunge him, call it a day, make sure he gets turned out tomorrow. Like, don't confuse these things. I think we so often just say, oh, it's an Arab, oh, it's a thoroughbred, it's a hot horse, and we write it off as that. And the truth is, that's not the problem. Hot horses, that is just a category that I don't think exists the way we think it exists. A hot horse is a horse that moves off your leg real quickly when you ask. A hot horse is someone who's maybe a little spooky, a little skittish. That's a hot horse. Pushing you over in the cross ties, prancing, chomping at the bit, rearing, striking as you're trying to lead it. That's not a hot horse. That's a horse with respect issues. That's a horse that didn't get turned out, or that's a horse that is in pain and trying to communicate with you.
Pretty much.
So that's down a different rabbit hole than a lunging rabbit hole. But I think the point is, don't use lunging to correct those issues. Those are not going to be corrected at the end of a lunge line.
I feel as though we've been all over the place today with this episode, but it's because there's so many rabbit holes and different things to look at with lunging. There's just so much to it that you can't just put lunging in a nice tidy package with a bow on top and saying, hey, here you go, this is all that lunging is. Because it's not it. There's so much more.
Right. And I mean, I think part of the problem is like, okay, my plan for the day is I'm going to go out and lunge my horse for 20 minutes and we're going to work on A, B, C, and D. And then you get there and you have a totally different horse, and your horse is crazy, or your horse is lazy, or your horse is just not feeling it, whatever it is. Like, that's why I think sometimes a lot of these topics aren't neat and tidy because they're so, like, our horses are different every single day. There are so many different ways to think about things. There's so much, everyone has such different experience when tackling these topics that I find it really hard sometimes to learn when those who are presenting the topic are just presenting it in one sort of plane and like, all horses lunge this way and all horses need this gear, when it's just like, that's just not the truth and that's not how it works. And there's so much, you have to just know your horse. Like, I'm going to say this 1,000 times. You have to know your horse. You have to know what they need, and you have to understand what they're communicating to you when they're being hot, when they're being lazy, when they're not paying attention and bumping into you. You have to try to understand every little thing they do so you can be the best handler and the best trainer for them.
Right. And groundwork just helps you understand how your horse communicates. It helps you understand their little nuances to signify, what they're feeling, what they're trying to express to you. And all this groundwork, all this lunging, it translates under the saddle. This all translates to how your ride will be.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Buck Brannaman and his style. I know it can be sometimes hard to listen to him because he does a lot of times, like, it almost feels like he's attacking dressage riders or he's attacking English riders. And I think a lot of it is he's actually attacking modern dressage riders and modern styles of riding. And you have to kind of like piece out what he's saying and realize that he's actually very pro classical style riding. It's just that what he's experiencing a lot of is modern dressage riders, and he has an issue with that. So I highly recommend watching. He's got a 7-part or 7 DVD training set that I rent from the library from time to time. He's got a couple books and things, and I highly recommend spending some time with Buck Brannaman's teaching theories and going to his clinics when they're near you. Okay, so back to like lunging. So how does lunging, like, how often do you use it when you are lunging a horse? Is this like a once a week, twice a week, once a month?
I'm very inconsistent with my lunging.
Aren't we all?
And I can't quite decide if that's a good or a bad thing. Because I can't always decide if I'm giving her the day off or if I'm lunging that day. And so, like, it comes back to needing to have a goal and having a goal when you go out there to lunge. And sometimes I just don't know why I'm doing it. And so rather than just wasting my horse on the lunge line, I opt out of it. And so instead, I'd rather do trick training or working in hand. But I know lunging has its place. So I don't know. I'm torn. But max, if I'm lunging, I do it once a week. But it's more like once every other month.
Yeah. So for me, like, lunging is definitely like a bad weather thing because I don't have an indoor arena. So a lot of times in the like fall, spring, winter, like 75% of the year, it's raining at my house. And I'm sorry, but I don't always feel like tacking up in the rain to ride my horse, especially when I know she doesn't like being ridden in the rain. So putting her on the lunge line for, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to make sure she gets some exercise, make sure her brain is thinking and she's working. We're still developing those gaits. We're still strength training. That's usually how I use it. So in the winter, I'll use it like maybe once to replace a day I probably would have ridden or could have ridden. And I'll use that. I'll just lunge her then. And in my mind, it's an easier day, even though like it's not, she still gets a good workout. It's still hard on her body. And so I just use that like once a week to replace a day I would have ridden.
Okay, so you're using it as a replacement for one of your rides.
Yeah, I like to use it as a replacement for one of my rides because for me, I am like 99% of my rides is strength training, conditioning, just trying to build up muscle because for so long, like I didn't know what Addie's problems were. She was just weak. She's got a weak joint. The connection between her bottom and her back is weak. And then her legs are, crap.
Poor Addie.
It's horrible. And she's now only sound at the walk. Which sucks. But like before I fully understood what was going on with her body, it was just strength training because that's what my vet wanted us to do. Like I was working with a vet. This is what the advice to her was that we just have to spend so much time building up her body. So for me, I was using that lunging to replace one of my rides.
Okay, so when you're using it to replace one of your rides, you're using it to build that muscle, build that strength.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I expect my horse to stretch on the lunge line without any side reins, without any gear on her face, in a halter. She knows to stretch. Like that's something I think is really important. All horses should be able to go long and low on a lunge line, just in a halter. You could use a bridle if you feel you need a little bit more play with them, and lunge them in just a bridle. She does not take kindly to the lunge line being attached to her face or to the bridle. So I have to, like, when I was lunging her in side reins and gear, I would have to put the halter over the bridle because she gets really frustrated.
Oh, I could see why.
Yeah, she's just really she's a mare and I don't think she liked the inconsistent pressure on the bit. And I would go over the head because I didn't have one of those fancy chin connectors yet, but she just didn't need that, right? Because that's a gag. So I guess maybe we should talk about how to connect your lunge line. I didn't even think of that, but I think that's a frustrating, how do I even connect the lunge line to my horse's head?
Oh my God, that's so freaking true. Probably until my C3, I only had one way of connecting my lunge line. And that was, I think, the way most people know, which is through the inside ring of the bit, up and over their pole, and then it attaches to the other side, the outside ring of the bit. And that was the only way I knew how. And that was the only way I was doing it until one of my instructors was like, honey, you know there's another way. And I was like, oh my God, what is this magical thing you speak of? Could it be? Is it possible? And as it turns out, there was another way. And it was by looping the lunge line through the inside ring of the bit and then through the noseband and attaching it back on itself.
Around the base, like under their chin, not over the nose.
Yeah, so then you just have direct pressure rather than indirect pressure, which the other way provides.
Yeah, so that's what I prefer to use, is that.
Same.
Yep, you wrap it once around the inside snaffle, and then you connect like a chin strap, just like, if you had a Pelham or a curb bit on, you'd do a chin strap.
Oh, you connect to the other side of the bit.
Yeah, I go to the other side of the bit. So the snap is on the outside, and then the rope goes under her chin, and the lunge line is just around the bit. How do you do it?
Okay. Imagine in your mind that you have your horse standing in front of you, bridle on, and if you can picture it, you have your snaffle ring of your bit that butts up against the noseband of your horse's bridle. And so the way I do it is I take the lunge line and I stick it through the snaffle ring, loop it underneath the noseband itself, and then connect the lunge line back onto itself. And that way, all I have is direct pressure. I don't have any of the indirect pressure or the crossover pressure of attaching it to the other side of the bit, which the reason why you loop it through the noseband is that way if your horse spooks or all of a sudden pulls away, you're not accidentally going to pull the bit through the horse's mouth. And babies absolutely love this method.
Interesting. I have never heard of that or seen that.
I've never seen yours.
Oh, so mine is that was one that our old riding instructor taught me to do it that way, the under the chin method. But basically stop going over the pole, because that's a gag, and a gag bit only lifts the horse's head up. And so you've just put side reins on, you're spending a whole bunch of time trying to get your horse to stretch and go low, but your lunge line is actually picking your horse's head up the entire time because it's pulling up on the bit. So stop going over the pole unless you want your horse's head up in the air. If that's what you want, go over the pole, but otherwise don't go over the pole. And I need to buy one of those little connectors, right? Because there's a little piece you can get where it kind of does how I use it, where it snaps onto both sides of the bit, and then the lunge line is just connected to the middle of it and can kind of pivot around. If that's how you're going to attach it, if you're using a snaffle bridle, that's a couple different ways. My horse, like I mentioned, she didn't like it going underneath her chin. She didn't like it over her head, obviously. I didn't know about your way. Maybe next time we'll try your way. But I just put her halter on over the bridle and then connect to the inside ring on the halter. Don't connect underneath the chin, because that will pull the halter sideways and you'll end up pulling it into their eye. Always connect to the side. So even if you're just lunging in a halter, you need to switch which direction you're, the lunge line, when you switch directions. Don't do it underneath the chin.
Yeah, and the way that I attach the lunge line, it just provides that direct pressure, which is so much clearer for horses to understand.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. When I was lunging her tacked up in gear, because I did go through a phase where I was lunging her in side reins, and then after a while, I was like, well, this is the dumbest thing ever. I need to stop. But it doesn't make sense to me to have you on your lunge line on the bit and side reins on the bit. That's just too much, in my opinion.
It's so much going on.
Exactly. And so if you are lunging in side reins or some contraption that goes through their bit, don't also be on the bit. Get out of there. Let the horse just listen to one thing. They don't need to listen to 3 different pressure points. That's so much pressure. That's so confusing. Put a halter on. Put a cavesson on. Find something else. It's just too much for them, and it's not fair. Lunging isn't just you hanging on the bit. Lunging should really be around that horse developing their balance, whether that's in gear or not in gear. So should we have our gear discussion? What do you use to lunge your horse?
Yes, I am very excited because we have a bit of opposing ideas on gear, or why we don't use it and why we do use it. And I think we're actually more similar than we think on why we use it and why we don't use certain things.
Yeah. I think we
also have different horses.
We have different horses, but we have the same end goal. And I think because of that, we get to the end product different ways.
That's a good way of phrasing it. I was just going to say my way's better. Just kidding. I'm seriously just kidding. It's whatever way works best for your horse and what your horse needs.
But then again, you have to know your horse and know what their weaknesses and strengths are so that you can pick the right gear, because when it comes to lunging, I think there's 100 things you can put on your horse. Horses, in my experience, I've lunged a lot of horses. Each horse has a totally different piece of gear they like. And none of them go in the same thing. So if you think you're going to buy one piece to go on all your horses, it's just not going to happen, because they all respond differently and all use their body differently. So I'd be prepared to invest in 100 different things if you're really set on lunging your horse tacked up in gear in a contraption.
So how do you want to dive into this? Do you want me to go first and just kind of run down a list of typical gear that's available on the market, or do you just want to go in and say why you don't use gear?
Let me go first, because I'm right. No. No. So I do have things to contribute to the gear conversation, but I do want to start with why I don't use it, because I think that's just sort of like, it's simple, it's clean, it's neat, and then we can get into, if you really need gear, what should you go for. I don't lunge Addie specifically or Nim in gear they're not balanced horses. And when I add side reins or something that is static, that only maintains whatever pressure my horse puts on it, they will find ways to avoid it. And we have all been yelled at how many times by our instructor, inside leg to outside rein. That is not there when you're lunging your horse. You don't have your body as a rider to adjust the pressure on a crooked horse. You don't have your leg there to adjust the horse's straightness. And what I found was that Addie would go beautifully to the left in her side reins. The left is her easy way. She would bend correctly. She would do everything she needed right to the left. And then we'd go to the right, which is her weak way. Her right hind leg is garbage. That's the one where her cannon bone is like curved, and she can't support herself to the right. And so what happens is she ends up just contorting her body so she can move correctly to the right. So like many of you, I was like, well, just shorten my inside side rein. That will solve the problem. Now she has to look to the right. So sure, I put more pressure on one side of her mouth, but I wasn't able to then release her when immediately, because that's the thing with riding, it's horses looking for that release of pressure, and your side reins rely on a big release of pressure to praise the horse. They often have to really change their bodies, and my horses have just found a way to contort their bodies because they're already unbalanced. Dublin, who is long, he also hates the same side reins I have. So the side reins I have are the kind with like a bunch of, they're very generic side reins. They've got elastic. They've got like 10 different loops you can hook through. You know, one end goes around the girth, one connects to the bit. They do not have donuts. They're not donut side reins. They're elastic side reins. And they have like too much give in them as well. So like Dublin would just like pull his neck and head to like the max with them and then like curl up behind them to avoid them. And so those like don't work with him at all. So I find it so much better for my horses to just go without gear and just learn how to use your body. I constantly am asking her to bend to the inside, to the right. I use my whip as my leg and I get a little bend on her nose. And that way she's learning to do it herself and not depending on my hands, not depending on the side rein to get her to move correctly.
Well, I can see where the frustration comes in.
Because all my horses, and your horse too, they're smart enough to figure out how to do it the easy way. And that's all it is. She just saw the side reins as like, okay, this is a challenge, you know, and I'm going to figure out how to get out of this the easy way. She doesn't want to lift her back and push underneath her, and especially as a horse that already has weaknesses, she's just going to bend her neck weirder. Like that's all she did was just like bend her neck stranger and like drop that shoulder out. She did not magically become straight and balanced in side reins.
Right. And so the way that side reins or really any training aid lunging device works is it operates under pressure. And it operates under almost like a sense of duress in which it applies pressure until the horse figures out how to release that pressure. And so you have to be very careful when applying these, because if you apply them too tight or inaccurately, your horse's only way of relieving that pressure is to contort their body, because that was the quickest way and the only way they could find to relieve the pressure.
And that's all she did. And that's because she, going back to the beginning, wasn't balanced and didn't have good gait. Now, if you have a trained balanced horse, a horse that knows how to use their body correctly, uses their body correctly under saddle, and is really balanced left to right. They're a very straight horse. They're a very supple horse. I absolutely think you can find training aids that horse will move well in because they already know how to use their body, where she uses her body like, a noodle and just contorts out of it.
Yeah, and that brings me to like one of my bigger pet peeves, especially with advertising of these different devices and stuff, is that you commonly see them being pushed towards green or young horses, in which it's here to teach your young horse how to carry themselves properly. It's here to teach them how to move in an outline, how to be round while you're working them. And that's not true. That's not correct. There's no way you're going to be acting on the horse's mouth and the horse's mouth only and expecting them to learn how to carry their body, nor acting on their pole. Like, you're only using a third of the horse's body.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also see a lot of riders who tie their reins to their saddle, and the reins are even like, there's no elastic there, there's no give. That's a constant pressure. All you're teaching is them to basically find behind the vertical as comfortable. So do not tie your reins to your saddle ever. Please, no. There's no give, there's no softness. That's just a hard, constant pressure on your horse's mouth, and all they're doing is finding a way to evade it. And again, we've said this 100 times, please don't lunge for more than 15 to 20 minutes. 20 minutes is max. I hate when I see the 45-minute posts. Like, no.
Well, lunging is 2 times as strenuous on your horse's body as a regular ride. So let's say 20 minutes on the lunge is the equivalent of a 40-minute ride, in which it's either moderate work to heavy work. So it's not the equivalent of a 40-minute warm-up or cool down. It's the equivalent of your horse being in work for a total of 40 minutes, which is the equivalent of that 20-minute lunging session, which is why it's so important to have a goal in mind or have something you're trying to attain when you go out and lunge your horse. Otherwise, there's no point to it, because you're either training or untraining your horse, or you're building muscle or tearing their bodies apart, and hopefully it's not the latter.
Right. And so, like, when it comes to gear, often nobody obviously walks to the arena in their side reins, right, because there's static. But you also should not be starting in your side reins. My horse always goes for several laps, probably like the first 5 minutes without the side reins, so she can warm up her body, so she can do whatever she needs to get herself balanced, so I can see how she's moving for that day. Like, some days she's lame, some days it's just like, oh, no, this isn't going to be a side rein day. And then those side reins go on for probably 10 minutes, and then they're off for the last 5 minutes while we like walk or do maybe some light cool down type lunging. But that's it. It's not 20 minutes of constant side reins or constant gear, or it should not be.
Yeah, so I guess we can just dive right into the equipment talking, whether you want to call it lunging aids, training devices, side reins, which I think is kind of frustrating off the bat with that, is that I find a lot of these different training lunging devices all get lumped under the term side reins, which they're not. You have very specific things that are side reins, and the rest of them is not side reins. So I picked out kind of a handful of the most commonly used lunging aids, training devices out there on the market that I think typically most people have seen, come across, people are regularly using. And that starts off with elastic side reins, which these will typically have 6 to 8 inch inserts of elastic in them. And then they will attach to the bit, and then they'll have a solid piece that comes back around and attaches around the girth with a row of metal loops on them that allows you to adjust the side reins to the desired length. And the idea behind these is that the horse can give a smaller effort and still receive a release in lieu of other side reins that are more stiff, or they don't have as much elasticity to them that offers that release. And then you have donut side reins, or they could be known as rubber ring side reins. And these are made out of a solid material, typically nylon or leather, and then within them there is a large rubber ring, thick piece of rubber. And these take a monumental effort on the horse's end to receive any type of release from them, which is why I really don't care for them. Out of probably all the side reins, these are one of my least favorite, that alongside of the side reins that have absolutely no insert, whether it's a rubber ring or elastic piece that offers that release. And then you have a bungee, and a bungee is typically entirely made out of either bungee material or elastic. It has a piece that sits between the horse's ears up on the pole that allows you to adjust the length of it. And then the bungee goes back and attaches either to girth loop, girth ring, or it attaches to the sides of the girth or D-rings, depending on how you're adjusting it for that day. Next is the very common system, which is the Pessoa system. And this is a series of ropes and loops and pulleys. And I'm sorry, but if it has this much going on, that's too much.
A complicated system.
That's so many places for someone to go wrong with adjusting it and setting it to all the wrong settings, someone to attach it incorrectly. Like, it's too much. Too much happening, too complicated. It's too freaking much. And our last training aid is known as the Waldhausen lunging aid. Now, this one is made out of a soft rope material with 2 connector pieces that connect to the bit. It goes in between the horse's front legs and then loops up and around the withers, which I particularly like this one because it does not use the pole as a leverage point. Now, to get kind of into my first point with lunging aids, training devices, no matter which one you're going to be using, no matter which one you're introducing, whether it's side reins, it's the Waldhausen lunging aid, it's the Pessoa system, you have to train your horse and teach your horse what the piece of equipment is asking. You have to explain to them what you're looking for, what, if you're applying pressure in this point, your horse is going to look for a way to contort their body, a way to release that pressure. And so you need to have an avenue open for them to understand what you're asking, what your goal is. And as Jim Wofford says, that your horse is not necessarily resistant. It's a lack of training. It's a lack of understanding. And so that's not your horse's fault. That is your fault.
Yeah, there is 100 and different one. So one of the side reins I love, you didn't mention, that's okay. I love the Vienna side reins, which are actually just draw reins that your horse can ride in. And it allows them, again, there's no elastic, but it allows them to sort of move up and down a lot easier with their frame. And they get a bigger range of motion, but they still have that guidance to encouraging them to loosen their head. It's actually a little bit more like the system you were describing, except for
the Waldhausen one.
Yeah, it's like that, but it's like reverse because it doesn't go over the back. It goes through the bit, but there's like this ability to move this system more than it is. It's not such a static system. There's more movement and more motion. There's no more give, I would say, but there's more motion within the system.
Yeah, so out of all those training aids, lunging devices that I just briefly explained, the only one that I use and actually like out of those is the Waldhausen lunging aid, because I appreciate that it goes around the withers and it doesn't act on the pole as a leverage point, which other systems do. I know in particular the bungee acts on the pole. And as we already know, the pole is a pressure point on the horse. We already talked about this in previous episodes. I don't want the pole any lower. There's no point in me acting on the pole. I'm not looking to get the pole low. I'm looking to see my horse stretch long and low. And so when we look at the history of some of these lunging aids, lunging devices, particularly side reins, the reason they were created was to give the horse and rider a feeling of on the bit when the horse is being ridden. They weren't meant necessarily for lunging, which we use them now for. And so now we see side reins always being used for lunging. And like you mentioned, the donut side reins, they take a monumental effort on the horse's part to get that release. And then as soon as they release, you see the side reins start bouncing up and down, jiggling the bit in the horse's mouth and tugging. And all that does is teach your horse to snatch the bit so it stops the bit from moving.
Right, like that's something that I noticed with Addie, and I think part of the reason she didn't really like the side reins is like, okay, once she releases then it's just jerking on her face. Like, that's not any better. Like, my hand wouldn't just be bouncing on her mouth. My hand would be like released and quiet and soft. And so, yeah, that's something that I like recently have had an issue with, and why, like, again, I stopped using side reins because like, this design is silly. This makes no sense. And that's why the Vienna is nice because there is sometimes, but it's a rope and it's not as heavy. So it does still have a little motion, but it's not the same as like those heavy duty side reins just swinging and bouncing.
And I don't think there's any way to actually get rid of that. You're not there on your horse. You're not there for that way. When they release, you can't remove the slack from the system so it doesn't start wiggling around in their mouth and jumping around. Like, you're not there to do that. And so that's why you have to be so careful, which with everyone you're using, that you use one that has the minimal effect. Another issue that I have with side reins is how many of us have been told, don't walk your horse from the barn to the arena wearing side reins? Because what if your horse spooks? What if your horse slips? They're going to get injured and they can't move and use their body correctly because they're restricted by the side reins. That to me is a big issue all on its own. There's no way that I'm going to be using a piece of equipment that I can't walk my horse to and from the barn in. There's a bigger issue happening if I can't use it in that way. Like, there's a bigger issue if I can't walk my horse from point A to point B without being afraid the piece of equipment is going to injure them.
Yeah, agreed.
And another thing, gosh, I'm so sorry. I have so many another thing is when you look at the advertising of these lunging aids, training devices, side reins, I would go out on a limb and say almost every single picture out there, every single advert out there shows the aid or the device being applied too tight. Almost every single one of them shows it being used incorrectly. Several pictures of the Waldhausen lunging aid applied, and the horse is behind vertical. The horse has a closed throat latch. They're using their body incorrectly. And it just baffles me, because how are people expected to go out and use these aids, use these devices, and use them correctly when the image they're going to try to replicate is what the advert was showing, is what the advertising is demonstrating?
Well, and that's the problem that part of the reason I hate lunging and gear is that it is, like you've said, it's so focused on their head placement, and part of that requires your horse to get their head behind vertical at the standing, or the walk or the trot, so at the next highest gait, their noses can come forward. And it's like, well, that doesn't make sense if my horse is going to be behind the vertical at the trot so that I can have a good canter. But the problem is, I do not believe these items, these training tools, should be used to get your horse to ride in an uphill frame. That uphill frame has to come from the back and go to the front. Side reins, any of these lunging aids, whatever you've chosen to ride in, is only about getting the horse to stretch. It's only about getting them to do long and low and build that top line and be relaxed and keep them from being above that hollow, right? Like, we don't want them hollow and upside down, but we're not going to get our horses on the bit in that first, second level frame. You have to stop using your lunging equipment to get your horse in that upper level riding frame and getting them around. It's all about just keeping them soft, stretching, and relaxed. And I think that's where this misconception comes with a lot of this gear, is that it's advertised to get your horse to move like an upper level dressage horse. And that it's just not going to work that way, because that has to come from the back. That has to come from a rider's leg, their seat, their hands. There's so many pieces that get the horse on the bit or get the horse into self-carriage, and it does not come from side reins.
Right. And so the only purpose of any of these aids and training devices is to get your horse working long, low, and slow. Because I think we can all agree we're not there to apply our leg when we're lunging. And that's the piece that's missing from all these training devices, because they're all acting on the front half of the horse and not the back half. And now some might come back with the rebuttal that the Pessoa system actually does apply pressure to the back end and helps the horse engage their hind end and works the whole entire body. That's not necessarily true. If you look at previous advertising for the Pessoa system, the back strap that people use at times to apply pressure, the breeching strap, is not meant to apply pressure. It's there to hold all the pulleys and strings and ropes in place so they don't bounce out of order. People will tighten it so it applies a little bit of pressure, and that's not what it's meant for. It's not meant to be applying any of that pressure. And on top of that, even with the attachments and fail-safes in there that make it so that way the horse's legs don't pull on the rope, which is attached to the bit, it still happens. Even when the horse is stepping with their hind end, it tugs against that breeching strap, which then tugs either against the surcingle, the girth, the saddle, but it also will tug on the bit, and that has a counterproductive effect. It doesn't work the way it's advertised to. There's no picture, no advert, no one using it on their own that shows the horse in front of the vertical. It's all with the horse slightly dropped back, their pole is dropped, and it just shows that the horses have to be more creative in how they contort their bodies, that it's not working the way people think it is.
Yeah, so I think we should, I want to talk about bum bands for just a second, or things that go around the horse's hind end, because I do use them myself, but I use them very consciously. I use an old track wrap. So it is like, it's a cotton wrap with just a little bit of stretch in it because of how it was how it's knitted. So these are like what you would have used at some point as exercise wraps before we found elastic. So I use this. It doesn't have a ton of stretch in it. I can only get it so tight. When my horse is moving, it loosens up. These can be used to make the horse think about the butt. And that's about it. To get them to think about their butt, to get that little tickle, does not take a ton of pressure. There are systems out there, there are designs out there where you've got an elastic, sort of like this elastic band that goes around the horse's butt, and you can really snug that up. And the problem with that is it changes how the horse moves in the hind end, and they often kind of like waddle in the back because they have too much pressure to get that leg to actually follow a more natural pattern. And so it does impact how they move their hind end. And so if you want to lunge, I recommend tying a track wrap to your surcingle, tying it to your stirrup leather loops on the back of your saddle. It has very little stretch, so you cannot get it too tight. It's going to kind of ride all around on your horse's butt and just makes them think about engaging their hind end. You cannot force their hind end underneath them because horses will find a way around it and they will start doing weird things with their body. So I love using it occasionally, even when I'm lunging, to get my horse to think hind end, and that is it.
That brings up a really good point in which all of these aids and devices are meant to teach the horse how to support themselves. They're not meant to be used to support the horse. One of the things with side reins that immediately eliminates them is the fact that they don't teach the horse to stretch long and low. Side reins teach a horse to fixate their head in one place to hold a shape, and that's not correct. On top of that, the Pessoa system, it really just teaches a horse to drop their pole and kind of fake using their bodies correctly, and yet they still aren't doing it. They're not using their body correct. And if you were to tighten the system down, all it does is condense your horse's body. It does not make them support themselves. A lot of times when you tighten these aids, when you tighten these devices, now they are just supporting the horse, and the horse is weighing on them instead of these being used to teach the horse to support themselves. And the way to check and make sure that you're using any of these correctly and that they're having the desired effect, and I do this particularly myself, is at the end of your lunging session, at the end of your ride, take these devices off, remove them, and go back out and see if you can replicate it without the training aid. So in particular with the Waldhausen lunging aid that I use to teach my horse to stretch long and low and over her top line, if I could remove that training aid and send her back out on the circle and she's able to maintain that and keep that, I'm using it correctly. If I send my horse back out after using side reins and they cannot hold themselves to where I was just placing them and asking them to work, then the device was supporting them and placing them there. The horse was unable to carry themselves to that point.
Yeah, and this is why I go back to I don't lunge with gear, because I want my horse to balance themselves. I want my horse responsible for their own body. I hate getting on a horse and you are doing all the work to keep them straight, all the work to keep them up. Lunging is a great opportunity for the horse without the rider to figure out how to use their body. And if the gear you're using isn't supporting your horse, and finding their own balance and allowing them to find their own balance, then you don't need it. There is in one of Buck's clinics, and I don't remember if it might be a clip on YouTube, he gave a lecture about why he hates side reins. And his lecture was the only way side reins will work is if there is like a gauge on the horse's head that rings every time and you're able to take the side rein completely off once they've like hit the perfect point. And that's just unrealistic. Like the side rein isn't just going to magically disappear when this little bell rings because your horse has hit that soft point. They're good. And of course you have like a split second to praise your horse when they hit that like good point. And the first time I heard this was like a year or two ago, and I was like, oh, he is crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And now after spending a lot of time lunging my horse throughout the winter to try to fix her canter, I was like, oh no, he was absolutely correct. He was right. Side reins they don't work because they just stay on. You don't have that timing. You don't have that feel that it requires to develop your horse's strength to carry themselves, and that they're finding that frame and finding that good spot. Lunging's not the place to do it.
That's actually kind of funny because Jim Wofford says pretty much the same thing, and that's who I base a lot of my stuff off of, and that I really like. I like his logic. I like how he approaches different problems, issues with those horses, and I like his mentality and how he handles things, but he says pretty much the same thing in regards to lunging.
This is like, I think that's funny that you just pointed out that Jim Wofford that Jim says the same thing, because I have this big belief that all good horse trainers come to the same conclusions at the end of the day, whether it's a Western rider, whether it's a dressage rider, whether it's a show jumper. All good trainers come to the same conclusion. It just takes their, because all horses respond and think the same way, whether it's a Western horse or an English horse. So it's just evidence, I think, of that they're both very knowledgeable people. Okay, so this is totally random, but I did just Google side rein lunging just to look at the images, just out of curiosity. Not a single one of these are good pictures. Like that is,
no, they're not.
That is just the problem we have going on with marketing and misunderstanding of equipment. Like this is photo after photo after photo of horses moving poorly, dropped backs, dropped in muscles in front of the withers, hollow. Like it's bad. And this is the problem. If you can't find a horse moving correctly, even in a Google image search.
Exactly. It takes you until an eBay ad to find an appropriate picture of the Waldhausen system being used correctly, and that's the original picture that Waldhausen used on their website advertising it. But the one picture that people love to share around clearly shows a horse in distress and behind vertical, and that's primarily every single picture that you see out there showing these lunging aids.
We're not saying lunging your horse tacked up and in gear is always bad. I think you just have to be really conscious of how you're using it and what you're trying to do. For us, lunging is gait development. That is all. I want good quality gaits, and my horse does not need to have its nose to its chest to get a good quality gait. And depending on my horse, they probably don't need anything on their face because they need to just work on balancing themselves. There's just so many horses that are so unbalanced. Just lunging them on the end of a line for 15 minutes, changing directions frequently, encouraging them to stretch long and low in either a halter or a bridle is all you need to make a big improvement. Just FYI, we own probably every lunging piece of equipment there is. We've got bungees. We've got 5 different kinds of side reins. Like, we have used it. We have tried it. We have failed. And that's where this is coming from. This isn't just like we found one thing and it works. No, we tried everything and realized it does not work. So we spent the money. We put the pain in for you.
No, we went all down this rabbit hole. We have been there. We did it. We went out. We spent the money. And these are products. These are systems that we used growing up that we fully believed in.
Yes.
That we used regularly on our horses. And it's just as we get older, as we read more and start to learn more and figure things out, we realize that they weren't acting and performing the way we thought they were.
Yes. Through our own trial and error, we are sharing with you what we've learned, and hoping that we can save you a little bit of money and a little bit of time when looking at some of these products. We still own all these things. I probably from time to time will pull them out again just to make sure I still think the same way. But
just to make sure they really don't work.
Right? And again, like I said, each horse is so unique in what they find, because each horse, something works a little bit different on them. And my Dublin, my trained show horse, goes great in Vienna side reins. For whatever reason, that actually works for him. I actually get a really good quality trot and canter where he's stretching, he's great. Any other type of side rein and he's hollow, he's avoiding. It just depends on your horse.
Right? No gear works for Kelsey's horses. Some gear works for my horse, and maybe none of this works for your horse. You just have to figure it out, play it by ear.
Yep, you might need to find a different option or some combination. But you do have to play with it, but again, know what that goal is. It's gait quality. It's long, low, and slow.
Well then, thank you guys so much for listening to our podcast today and sticking with us till the end. If you want to send us questions or have discussions that you want us to talk about, you can email us at mudstudsskullcaps@gmail.com. And you can reach out to us on Instagram as well at mudstuds_skullcaps.
And remember, guys, stay safe, stay classy, and stay in the saddle.
Bye.
Bye.